When I'm thinking about students, I'm thinking about 3 types of students now. So I categorize them into 3. So when I'm planning or thinking about my audiences and I'm thinking about students, there's 3 types of student groups that I'm processing. You might have more, that's fine. 3 seem to be really important, and for me, it helps me be intentional in my ministry. I think number 1 about students in my community. So these are students within my local church context. I've been given a responsibility for the students that God has placed in the families that call our church home. Just want to call that out. And any student that comes to my ministry and they call it home, I've been called to be a pastor of those individuals, and God has called me, He's allowed me to steward the children that He's placed in my care. So there's a real heavy responsibility that goes with that. But that's not the only people group. I think of those outside of my community. So I think about the place that I've been positioned geographically, and I go, okay, God, you've given me a pastoral responsibility for this community. One of the things you should think about is, who are the students in your community? Who are the schools that are in the area that you find yourself in, the city or town that you live in? Have you considered that God has uniquely called you into that space with a type of responsibility for those kids as well? And then the third group that I think about are students that are ready to lead in my community. Who are the kids where actually, they're committed to Jesus, they're understanding some of their gifts or abilities, and they're starting to move on point towards mission? And how do I equip, encourage, and support them and design opportunities for them to actually move forward in the mission that God's called them to? And I think we need to think about those 3 groups. Here's one of the things, just pause for a second. When you think about those 3 people group, who do you naturally lean to the most in your ministry? Take a second and maybe just circle the group that you naturally lean to the most when it comes to your ministry. And maybe ask the question, why is that? And there could be lots of reasons for that, by the way. I think when we think about our ministries, there's different seasons. So there were seasons in my ministry where I realized that more of our kids were pretty mature and I needed to call them to something more, so I had to design more missional opportunity for them. There were other times when I thought like a lot of my leadership kids had graduated and now I had a new group of kids coming in. We needed to go a little bit deeper. And then there was seasons when I was like, oh man, the community has a great need. We need to move outward a little bit more. And I think it's okay for us to think in terms of seasons and to place emphasis that way as well. So maybe one of the questions that you should ask, especially coming out of COVID, is there one of these 3 student groups that you need to place a little bit more of an emphasis on now over the next 6 to 10 months? And which group might that be? So you should consider that. Hey, let me just say something about student leadership for a second, if I could, just a quick aside. We got to spend time with my friend Dave Ron. Dave Ron does a lot of research in the US, and they did a book called Reimagining Evangelism. They were looking at youth ministries that were doing really good work in terms of peer-to-peer evangelism. And for them, that was the apex of student leadership. Does that make sense? Where they were seeing peer-to-peer evangelism. Here was the really unique aha that I took away from that. I talked to him about it. He said, youth ministries where their primary purpose when it comes to student leadership development is to run programs were actually quite ineffective when it came to peer-to-peer evangelism. Because instead of spending their time in building relationships and being intentional with their peers, they spent time working on program. And instead what they said is when we began to train and equip our students to be more intentional with relationships and engaging in mission, we saw that peer-to-peer evangelism go way up. And I just thought, oh, that's so interesting, because I think when I think about student leadership, I often think about task. I don't think about relationship and mission. And I started thinking, how can I start positioning my students so they can be more effective in that space? Okay, so that's just an aside. Okay, a couple of quick things here. Key task. I think a key task that we should think about when it comes to our students is deepen. How do we continue to help our kids go deeper in their love for Jesus and in their love for others? That sounds fairly biblical, yeah? I think that fits. Helps me focus up there a little bit. When I think about my personal assessment, here's the question I'm asking myself is, am I really intentional in terms of what I'm doing with my students? Have I thought through my year? Have I thought through the moments when I want to go into the deep end a little bit more, when I want to be a little bit more in the shallow end of the pool? And Jay will talk about that a little bit more. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take just a minute. I want you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. How intentional are you when you think about planning for the spiritual growth of your students right now? Scale of 1 to 10. 10 being really intentional, 1 being not very intentional at all. Are you intentional? When I think about working with my students, I have a couple of key strategic focuses. I'm just going to toss those out there so you have some categories at another time when you think about how to be intentional. But when I'm thinking about key strategic focuses, I'm thinking about my architecture of my ministry. These are things like documentation around plan to protect. These are things when I'm thinking about communication strategies. These are things when I'm thinking about my program and my timing of my events. So I think about the architecture of my ministry. Number 2, I think about the culture of my ministry. What are the values that I want expressed in my ministry, and what are the behaviors that actually express those values that we want to affirm over and over again? I think about architecture, I think about culture, I think about content. What's the content that I want to deliver over this next year? How do I want to deliver that content, and how do I want my students to process it? And then how do I want them to apply it? Let me really quick give you a bit of an imagination when you're thinking about that. You're not going to think about it too much now, but when you go from here, I think oftentimes when I used to think about content, I thought about what I was delivering in my program moment. And then when I began to shift that to think about, oh, how could my volunteer leaders bring content to their kids outside of my program moment, that became a game changer. And so I started thinking about in terms of like spiritual formation practices that my leaders could share with their students outside of the program moment. And all of a sudden, faith became more than just a program for my kids. And that was a real shift for me in that, okay? So I think about content, and then finally I think about my experiences. And these are things like missions trips, these are things like retreats, these are things like conferences. And I think all 4 of those areas are really important when we're thinking about our students and can help us be really holistic when we think about our year planning, okay? Okay, here's what I want you to do then. I'm gonna just take like 2 minutes, and I want you to evaluate your work with your students real quick. I want you to think about what's a strength that you have in your ministry when it comes to working with your students, what's maybe a weakness that you have when you think about working with your students, and what might be a next step that you think you should take to just turn the dial up, like even 10% when it comes to working with your students, okay? So this is personal assessment. By the way, at the end, we're gonna start gathering together and start sharing, okay? So this is just personal assessment. Take 2 minutes. Think about your work with students right now. Go ahead and do that for 2 minutes.